When I was given 2 cars. Hi, welcome to today's little lesson. Thank you very much for joining me once again as we continue our verse-by-verse study through the Gospel of Luke. And although the title of today's sermon may seem a little bit odd for an expository message, if you stick with me, you'll understand how it fits in. In fact, you're going to understand pretty soon. We have been looking over the last few lessons at Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, found in Luke chapter 6, and we've compared it to some degree with his Sermon on the Mount. Hopefully, if you were with us on those lessons, you were edified and all that. I want to go back to one section in this Sermon on the Plain that I felt maybe I should have spent a little more time on. Okay, and that is Luke chapter 6, verses 37 and 38. There, Jesus tells his audience, don't do 2 things, and then he tells them, do 2 things. Okay, so we have the negatives and the positives nicely balanced here. And that's a good practice to observe and to follow in all of our relationships with everybody. Too much negativity is too much negativity. Too much positivity is, also a little bit unbalanced. So we want to stay balanced. Anyways, here's the 2 negative things that Jesus warned against doing. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. And so there's an incentive there not to judge. It's to avoid reaping what you sow. And then the next negative warning is very similar. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. So good incentive. Now, if we look a little more closely at other times when Jesus said this, namely in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, he similarly said, do not judge lest you be judged. And then he elaborates on it, and we get a little better idea as to what he's talking about. And it becomes very clear that he's not talking about, don't make any moral appraisals of anyone at any time, because he tells them in that same sermon that they should be making moral appraisals at certain times, particularly when they're examining the fruit of those who are leaders and teachers. And it becomes very clear that what Jesus is really referring to there is kind of putting yourself in the position where you're always finding fault with everybody, because Jesus goes on then in Matthew, and it goes on then on the Sermon on the Plain, don't be looking at the speck in your brother's eye when you've got a log in your eye, always finding fault. And that fits beautifully within the context here where Jesus don't judge, and he says don't condemn. So people who are judging, at the same time are often, it's condemning. They're finding fault, and they're saying, pointing the finger. So now we segue into the positive things that Jesus does, and similarly, he gives incentives that, because of the basic principle that God is just, and because God makes sure that everybody reaps what they sow, we want to be careful what we're sowing. If we're sowing judgment and condemnation, you're going to reap it. And the question is often asked, well, who do we reap it from? Do we reap it from other people, or do we reap it from God? I submit to you both. Okay, first of all, experience tells us that when we're finding fault with others and condemning others, well, we're more apt for them to say, well, you're fair game now too. You seem like you've put yourself on a pedestal of in the judge's seat, and you're finding fault. So therefore, that you must think you have the right to find fault because you're at a higher level than the people that you're judging and finding fault with and condemning. And so we're going to find fault with you. We often see that, don't we? If you watch, for example, if you're involved in social media, particularly that side of social media where it's current events, and a lot of fault finding, okay, and often the fault finders are exposed as being hypocrites because someone will, say, well, here's what they just said, but look what they said 2 years ago. The exact opposite. So, they're hypocrites. So they make themselves fair game. Now, similarly, on the positive side, Jesus said, Pardon, and you will be pardoned. Okay, and again, that's just a reaping what we sow. If we show people mercy and grace, we're gonna reap the same thing, and not just from people, but also from God. Okay, remember James wrote, judgment will be merciless to the one who is shown no mercy. And that's, you read it in context, he's talking about standing before God and being judged. So there's an incentive. You want to get more mercy from God when you stand before him? Well, every time someone does something that is potentially offensive to you, you show them mercy. And if it's something, if it's a major offense and it requires confronting them, well, when they admit their guilt, well, pardon them and you will be pardoned. And that's really what the Lord's talking about, okay? Amen. And again, people are merciful to merciful people. They're apt to be more merciful. Okay. But God, he sees everything. He knows everything. Now, here's what I wanted to get to in the crux of today's lesson. You'll see how it fits into the title. Jesus said, give and it will be given to you. Well, there it is. You see how that fits into that sequence of 4? Don't do this or else you'll get the same thing. Don't do this, you'll get the same thing. Do this, you get the same thing. And here's the fourth one. It's the second positive one. Give, and it will be given unto you. And I think it's safe to assume that works on a human scale and it works on a divine scale as well. But Jesus elaborates on this one, and I like that because he said, given it will be given to you, they will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. Okay, now that's a little bit cryptic to those of us who aren't buying and selling grain and so forth, but in an agrarian society where people are saying, yeah, I've got this omer, that's, I know, one of the measurements, or I'm just holding out my garment here. That's how it's done. Sometimes hold out the front of your garment and to get so much grain that you're buying because you've got nothing else to carry it in. But so they'll give it to you and it'll be a good measure, pressed down. So let's say you're bringing, a quart jar. It's a good measure, a measure you can trust. It's pressed down, so and shaken together. So when you shake things, like how they tend to settle down, you can get more into the container. So pressed down, shaken together, and get this, and running over. So I love the imagery there. Okay, so when we give, it comes back to us in abundance. Hallelujah. And Jesus elaborates even more. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. So that's basically saying the same thing. At least it seems to be saying the same thing once again. To the degree that we give, to that degree we get back. And so remember, Paul wrote this in one of his letters to the Corinthians when he was admonishing them to be saving up every week because he was going to be coming or taking up an offering for the poor saints in Jerusalem. And he makes it very clear, those who give bountifully will reap bountifully. Those who give sparingly will reap sparingly. Where did he get that? Well, he could have got that right from Jesus' Sermon on the Plain that we're reading right here. Okay? So it's a principle. It works. It absolutely works. And so if you want to be blessed, well, be a blessing. Now, I do understand that some folks, preachers and some churches, they focus on this stuff so much, they get so unbalanced. It becomes like a get-rich-quick scheme, or the whole entire motive in the giving as it's presented is so you can get back in return. Well, that's unbalanced because we ought to give because we love God and love people. And if there's a sub-motive there of, God's going to pay me back, so it's not costing me anything in the long run, that's great. You can't get away from verses like this that we're reading in Luke 6 and verse number 38. It's biblical. But let's stay balanced. We don't give to get. We give because we love God, we love people, and we also have that assurance that any sacrifice, God's watching it very closely, and he's going to repay us. I mean, Jesus is the person who said, if you give even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who believe me, you truly said it, you will not lose your reward. So God's keeping track of it all. All right. The famous scripture in the 3rd chapter of Malachi, which is one that's been way overused in churches about, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. And I'm not going to elaborate on how that's abused. But again, this principle that we're reading is mentioned in, that passage in Malachi. Because God says, if you'll bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, see if I will not pour out a blessing until you have no more need. So it's give, and it'll be given unto you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. All right? Okay, now, I have endeavored from the time that I first became a believer. I got this early on. That I'm supposed to be a giver, and I had no one to guide me. I was just a teenager when I believed in Jesus, and kind of on my own, just reading the Bible. But I figured out pretty fast that God cares about the poor, and I began looking for a way that I could help the poor. I think I started sending money to an organization like World Vision or something. I forget exactly, but eventually I had a bit of awakening myself, even to a greater degree, when I was pastoring, serving in my 3rd of 3 pastors. This was, a couple decades ago, when I began seeking the Lord a little bit more as to, what do you think about my ministry? What do you think about my church? And so forth. And the Lord directed me to Matthew chapter 25. And there I read of the future judgment of the sheep and the goats. And that really became ultimately the birth of the ministry that I've been involved in for over 2 decades now. It's called Heaven's Family. Our core scripture is taken from Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. There's a family that's going to heaven. Isn't that the message of the sheep and the goats? That they're a family because they love each other. How do you know they love each other? Because they care for each other when certain ones are facing pressing needs. Those are the ones Jesus calls the least of these. And they're hungry and thirsty and naked. And, and often, we connect it with persecution. They're a stranger, so they've had to flee. They're, they need a place to stay. And so I had an awakening, a major awakening. It was a milestone in my spiritual life and ministry, and set in motion a lot of what we've been involved in for the last 2 decades. And we've done projects in over 80 nations of the world, endeavoring to serve the least of these with the help of thousands of fellow believers who also take that responsibility seriously. And actually, we've had people invest from over 40 nations of the world. It boggles my mind sometimes. People are sending us donations to care for the least of these, and they live in nations where the least of these live. Maybe not where they live, but it's been an interesting journey. So anyways, all that is just to say that I've been focusing on giving all of my Christian life and taking it very seriously the last 22 or so years, giving in the categories of what Jesus said we ought to give. And the New Testament says we ought to give. And really, if you study it, and I hate to break this to you if you didn't know this already, but if you study it in the New Testament, there's only 2 categories of giving that are New Testament giving. And they are, number 1, caring for the poor, particularly the poor among the body of Christ. And number 2, supporting ministries or ministers who are involved in preaching the gospel. Okay? And not just evangelists and apostles, but also there's scriptural evidence that those who devote themselves as pastors, elders, bishops, whatever you want to call them. I'm not going to go into all that, but these are synonymous terms. Elder, pastor, and bishop are synonymous terms. They're just over a local body. And there is evidence that they are to be remunerated for their efforts, particularly when they're working hard at preaching and teaching, and it's a full-time responsibility to them. That being said, a lot of what is passed off as giving in today's church is not giving at all. It's just paying your dues. What do I mean by that? Well, pastors often get up in front of their congregations and they'll admonish them to give because we're about to take up an offering, or we've got a collection box in the back of the church sanctuary, and people are, encouraged to give, which they ought to be encouraged to give because they're benefiting from the ministry there. They came to a building that somebody has to pay the mortgage on, somebody has to do the maintenance on, someone has to pay for the utilities if there's electricity or natural gas coming in there to heat that building. Someone has to pay for someone to clean that building, so of course everyone who's benefiting from whatever happens in that building ought to be paying something. And of course, if there are church staff members, pastors, secretaries, youth pastors, whatever you may have, those people, if they're devoting their full time, they can't do it just as a volunteer unless they're, independently wealthy. And so they need to be paid. And so if you're benefiting from the ministry of a local church, you ought to be giving. And so a lot of pastors preach tithing. That's really not a New Testament principle, but it's a biblical principle, and it predates the law of Moses, so nothing wrong with that. Everybody, I think, ought to be at least giving 10%. But here's the problem that I have with that, and I may elaborate on this a little bit more if I have the time. If all you're giving and everyone else is giving basically stays within those four walls, the ministry that happens here, it's not really giving at all when you think about it, because you're benefiting. Now, if you were giving money to a missionary, see, that's different. You're not benefiting from that missionary or that apostle, maybe another word for missionary. If you're caring for the poor and giving to the poor, so you're not benefiting from that. You will, of course, benefit because God will pay you back. Okay, that's giving. But I feel sorry for folks who give only to their local church, and basically all that money stays right there, to pay for the ministry from which they and everyone else benefits. So they get, somebody leads the worship. Maybe they have a paid worship leader. A lot of big churches have that these days, and they have paid musicians. Well, you're paying for the concert. Yeah, there's worship going on there. It's a very expensive concert. If everyone's giving 1/10 of everything they earned that week, a concert plus a sermon, plus, babysitting for your kids where they maybe do some teaching of the Bible and so forth. It's an expensive thing. If it's looked at from purely a business standpoint, it raises a lot of questions simply because, if anyone else had a venue that they only rented out for 2 hours once a week, that would not be much of a business. And you'd say, what's the point of having this building empty all these, every other day except for a few hours on one day of the week? Wouldn't make a lot of sense from a business standpoint nor from a stewardship standpoint. Well, the early church, of course, I imagine they didn't build any buildings, and there's no record of anyone taking up an offering for a church building. Church met in houses, and the pastors weren't superstars. They were servants. Okay. I don't want to go too far there. But anyways, the title of this message was, when I was given 2 cars. So I'm going to tell you those stories in the time I have remaining, okay? This first story would be close to, 18 years ago or so. We had just started the Ministry of Heaven's Family on a shoestring budget. I was earning very, very little at the time. because there just wasn't much to pay anybody what we consider a fair wage. But, trying to build that ministry and trying to find, people that would actually care about the least of these and so forth, not easy to do in North America. But I was one time holding a conference that we invited everyone we knew to in a little town in Texas. And seems to me like we rented, some retreat center or something, and it was kind of a dying retreat center, so the price was kind of low. And they had a meeting room, and I did a weekend conference there. And we had maybe 50 people who came, and they were all, good soil. It was a joy to teach them. But at the end of that conference, there was a couple, an older couple that came up to me, and I got to know them more as the years went on. They were named Paul and Dixie. And Paul was involved in some aspect of the oil industry, had his own business there, I think, doing something, looking for oil or reporting, to oil companies. I don't understand it, but he had a good year, I guess. And he said, "Hey, my wife and I feel led." Actually, they first asked me, what kind of car are you driving? And I told them I was driving a Camry and how many years old it was. And they said, is it an okay car? I said, yeah, it's an okay car. I said, nothing wrong with it. I said, the check engine light's been on, is on, but it's been on for about 2 years. So I'm happy, I'm content, And they said, well, we just feel led to buy a new car. And, we're going to give you $20,000. Well, I'm filming this in 2025, so go back 20 years. $20,000 was a lot more than what it is today with all the inflation. And so I was floored, and my wife was floored, and we thanked them, and then began, thinking about that. What should we do? And they wanted us to buy a brand new car. And you could get a new car for $20,000, a pretty decent one back then. But I thought, it's probably better to buy a used car. And because cars depreciate so quickly, you can get a good used car, 3-4 years old. So I asked them, would it be okay if, I'm getting ahead of myself. About 1 or 2 weeks later, I was preaching in a weekend service in Virginia. I think it was Harrisonburg, Virginia. It was actually a Slavic church, mostly immigrants from Ukraine and Russia and so forth. But they were, a lot of them spoke English, and they had me come and speak because of a mutual friend who recommended me. And we stayed in the house of a beautiful couple. I think they were Ukrainian, and he had started a used car business. And he said to me, without me prompting him or making any mention, he said, "Hey, if you're ever in the market for a used car, I go to the auction all the time, and I buy cars and I sell them, and I'd be happy to sell you a car for exactly what it cost me at the auction. So you'd get it at the wholesale price." And I said, "Well, thank you so much. I just happened to be in the market, as of, a week or two before when someone said they wanted to buy me a new car." And he said, "What are you looking for?" I said, "I'm looking for a Camry, a Toyota Camry." That's what I had, and I liked that car. And I told him the year. I think, I was looking for like one 4 years old. And he said, "Well, I got one. I just bought it." I think he said it was either 3 or 2 years old. And he said, "It's on the lot right now. It was in a small accident, so the front end is smashed. I got it at a really good price, and I'm going to get it repaired, and I'll sell it to you for exactly what I bought it for, plus the repair. And you can come and see it." He says, "You can drive it." He said, it actually drives right now. He said, "You can't drive it too far because the radiator was damaged, and so, you don't want to overheat the car." I went and saw it. I loved it. I said all that to say I contacted Paul and Dixie in Texas and said, "Hey, would you mind if I would, instead of buying a new car, just buy a used car? Because this is going to actually cost me less than $20,000. I think it was going to cost me like $13,000. And they said, "Well, okay." And I said, and I'll put the rest of the money towards the ministry of Heaven's Family because we could use the money, They said, "Well, if that's what you want to do, that's fine with us." We just felt led. So I bought the car. I think I bought it for like $13,000. And I did ask Paul and Dixie in the meantime. I said, "Are you going to write that check out to me, or are you going to write that check out to Heaven's Family?" And they said, "Well, we need to write the check out to Heaven's Family because we need the tax write-off. This is a donation to a 501c3. And I said, "Oh, okay." So what that meant was it complicated things a bit. That means that, I was going to have to get a salary raise. And that, that was complicated, getting the board to agree and all, just a bit of a hassle. And so I believe I traded in my existing Camry to that guy, and he bought it at a really good price. So the difference was like $5,000. That's all I had to come up with. And so I wound up just, I had some money saved. I had been saving for a car. I put a little bit away, every month when I got paid, and I had at least $5,000 saved. And so I just paid it cash myself and drove away with a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old Camry. I think, I saved like $4,000 off of what the retail price had been. Plus I got a real good trade-in on my old Camry, And in the end, I never told Paul and Dixie this. They're actually with the Lord now, so I don't have to worry about them finding out. But all that money, their $20,000 went to Heaven's Family. And I never, got any of it because I didn't give myself a raise or anything. And the Heaven's Family needed it, and it helped the least of these. So anyways, I guess you could say someone gave me a car and I didn't accept it. Or they gave me $20,000 and I gave it away to care for the poor. And so I think the Lord saw that. And some years later, I was sitting at lunch with a friend who was a donor to Heaven's Family. His name was also Paul. And he asked me a question, what kind of car are you driving? I said, I'm driving a Camry. It was that Camry I just told you about. And he said, well, how's it running? I said, it's running great. And he said, well, that's great. He says, but I want to buy a new car. And I was actually making more money then, I wasn't in such desperate straits. And I said, what? He said, yeah, I just feel like I've had a good year. He was a business guy. He said, I'd like to buy a new car. He said, you've been thinking about a new car? I said, well, actually, I just said to my wife the other day, I said, if we ever get another car, I kind of like those Honda CR-Vs, I saw those, a little SUV. And he said, well, go call the 3 Honda dealers around the area, get a price on them on a brand new Honda CR-V, and then let me know which one, and I'll come out and buy it for you. So there was no, he didn't have to give the money to Heaven's Family, He didn't give me any options, It was just, I'm going to buy you, David, a car, and I'm going to write a check to the dealer. So I was floored. My wife was floored. But given it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. And so I called 3 dealers. I got the best price. I called up my friend Paul. He said, which model did you get? And I said, well, I got the most basic model. He says, oh, no. You wanted to get the leather interior. So he called the dealer and upgraded it, And I met him, I think, that day. Yeah, it was that day. Met him at the dealer. I walked in the dealer, and I said, my name's David, and I told him, my last name. And he says, oh, well, we expected you're coming. Mr. Paul so-and-so called us, and he's on his way. And so I came in and sat down. I started signing papers and so forth. Paul came in, and he said, what's the total? And it was like $32,000. He wrote a check for $32,000, handed it to him. He says, anything else needs me? Nope, you're fine. And he walked off. I'm sure they're wondering, who is this guy who gives away cars? And who's this guy who's the beneficiary, And so I actually felt a little bit guilty about it, I still had my other car, my Camry. And I eventually sold that outright. But I was actually doing a lot of traveling, and I was going to be overseas, for at least a month. So I just parked that CR-V Honda in the garage, and I thought maybe I should just hide it for 2 years so no one sees me driving a new car. Because I always preached, the best way to save money on a car is not buying a new one; it's to buy a used one. And I'm not saying everyone should buy a used car. That's between you and the Lord. And if you have the money, go ahead and buy a new car. Make sure you're a giver. By the way, though, make sure you're a giver first of all. Anyways, I just started driving that CR-V. Had it for like 7 or 8 years, and it was a beautiful car. I put 140,000 miles on it. So, and then I sold that, and I have my current car, which is another Honda. Okay, so that's the story, and I'm going to keep on giving, okay, because I know that there's not only, we lay up treasure in heaven when we give, but we also, God returns blessing to us on this earth. He doesn't always just give us stuff. He often gives us opportunities to make money, and that's actually better, because, if you start receiving free cars all the time, you start thinking, well, I'm never going to buy another car ever again. I'm just going to wait for someone to give me one, and that's a mistake. Okay, well, for employer does that to you. It kind of ruins you, so beware. Okay, well, I'm out of time. Thank you so much for joining me. Give and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaking together, running over. Make sure you're giving biblical giving. And if you're looking for a place to care for the poor, Heaven's Family. Heaven, the letter S, the word family.org is the place for you to get involved in caring for the least of these, okay? Till next time, may the Lord keep blessing you as you keep obeying Him.